I'm Dave Wilson. I'm a member of the People for Effective Government, or PEG. Thank you all for coming tonight to this event, and a very heartfelt thanks to Gonzaga University for the use of this wonderful facility. PEG is a fairly new nonprofit organization with shallow pockets. So we greatly appreciate Gonzaga working with us to have such a fitting venue for our distinguished speaker. Please join me in a round of applause for all the wonderful people at Gonzaga University. I'd like to take a minute to put in a plug for PEG. Before introducing our speaker, PEG is not only a nonprofit organization, we're also a Spokane-based nonpartisan coalition. PEG's mission is to support bipartisan approaches to governing, which are fiscally responsible and ensure an adequate social safety net and promotes a civil society. The members of PEG are committed to changing the current political climate in which our two major parties have become increasingly polarized. More specifically, we're committed to encouraging sincere and civil debate about the challenges that our nation faces and effective solutions to these challenges. If you are interested in learning more about PEG and possibly becoming a member, please visit our website at pegnow.org. I have the honor of introducing our speaker, retired career U.S. Ambassador Ryan Crocker. Ambassador Crocker served our country in the U.S. Foreign Service for 40 years. While some diplomats get to serve in such places as tropical paradises or cosmopolitan settings like Paris or London, Ambassador Crocker spent his entire career in the Middle East. During his long career, he was stationed in about a dozen different Middle East countries, and he was ambassador to 6 of those countries: Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Syria, Kuwait, and Lebanon. I want to share a couple of things about Ambassador Crocker's career that I think are extraordinary, and I think he's probably too humble to mention. In late 2002, the Bush administration was preparing for war with Iraq, and then Secretary of State Colin Powell asked Crocker to prepare a secret memo examining the risks associated with the U.S. invasion of Iraq. His 6-page memo proved to be prescient. It was titled "The Perfect Storm." It stated that toppling Saddam Hussein could unleash several unintended consequences. It also cautioned that the United States would have to start from scratch in building a political and economic system because Iran's infrastructure would be mostly destroyed. Now, it seems to me that some people did not get that memo. So by 2006, the Iraq War was going terribly, and in what some might call irony, Ambassador Crocker was called upon to be the ambassador to Iraq in 2007. And for those of you who are not old enough to remember, President Bush had decided to implement a surge in U.S. troop numbers at that time. And this move was not without controversy, and there was an abundance of political drama surrounding this decision. However, both critics of the surge and independent news services have stated that the conventional wisdom in the United States is that the surge worked. This includes many members in the media and leaders from both political parties. And much of the credit for the success of the surge and the subsequent stabilization in Iraq has been given to Ambassador Crocker and to his military counterpart, General David Petraeus. Ambassador Crocker has also been recognized for his significant contributions and achievements to the country. In September 2004, President Bush conferred upon him the diplomatic rank of Career Ambassador. This is the highest rank in the Foreign Service, and it's the equivalency to a 4-star officer in the military. In January 2009, President Bush awarded Ambassador Crocker the Presidential Medal of Freedom. This is our nation's highest civilian honor. Upon his retirement in July 2012, Crocker was also named an honorary Marine by the United States Marine Corps. Since leaving government service, he has taught at the University of Virginia, Yale, and Princeton. Now here's the best part. He's from Spokane. And he's back. He lives here most of the year. I asked him, I said, you've been all over the world. Why Spokane? And he said, you can't beat the Pacific Northwest, specifically the inland Northwest. So, and he's a graduate of Whitman College. How many Whitman grads in the audience tonight? Okay. They beat Whitworth the last couple years in basketball, so they're probably popularity's down.
Which is why I'm not speaking there.
Good point. And Ambassador Crocker was also awarded an honorary Doctor of Laws degree here at Gonzaga in 2009. So this is, yes. The members of PEG believe deeply in the good work of the State Department and the U.S. Foreign Service and the vital role that it plays in protecting American interests and promoting world peace. General James Mattis said it best while he was Secretary of Defense. If you don't fund the State Department fully, then I need to buy more ammunition. It's a cost-benefit ratio. The more we put into the State Department's diplomacy, the less we have to put into our military budget. Ambassador Crocker will talk for 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up to question and answers. We ask that you hold your questions until the conclusion of his talk, and then we have 2 microphones for both sides of the room, and we'll have you line up here for questions. This evening's presentation and question and answer is being videotaped and will be available on the PEG website if you care to see it again. The members of PEG are very grateful to Ambassador Crocker for agreeing to be our September speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome retired Career Ambassador of the United States Foreign Service, the Honorable Ryan C. Crocker.
Thank you, Dave, for that very generous introduction. It's great to be here with all of you. It's great to be back in Spokane. There are a lot of interconnections here. You mentioned General Jim Mattis. It's a source of great satisfaction to folks in this part of the state, those who know about it, that the finest Marine officer of his generation, a lot of people feel the finest military officer of his generation, did not go to Annapolis. He graduated from Central Washington State College. Did his growing up in Pullman and Richland, and still maintains connections in Richland. Another little factoid, I am from here, and those of you I was born here. My father was born here. And those of you who are old Spokane, you know that there's kind of a way of looking at people. If you're born here and you are here, you're from here. My mother was born in western Montana, moved here at the age of 10, and died here 85 years later. She was considered from away. So, as Dave mentioned, I did receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom. That has been presented to 2 Foreign Service officers. I'm one. The other was a great diplomat named Philip Habib. Like me, Ambassador Habib did not have an advanced degree, came into the Foreign Service straight out of his undergraduate years. Like me, he did not study political science. I was an English major, philosophy minor at Whitman. Phil Habib went to the University of Idaho and majored in forestry. I derive a certain bit of satisfaction from retailing that anecdote to my grad students at Princeton and Yale, all in there doing political science and stuff like that so they can get to the top in the Foreign Service. Just send them back to the trees. Let me just start by asking a question, what is the Middle East? What do we consider that to be? It wouldn't probably surprise you to know the definitions are many. Defense and Central Command all have different definitions. If that little light went on saying, I think I'm starting to understand why we have a problem, we can't even agree on what it is. For me, it's the arc from Morocco in the west through North Africa, countries of the Levant. That would be Israel, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, the Arabian Peninsula, south and east, Iraq. That's the limit of the Arab world, but not the limit of the Middle East. To farther east, you have 3 countries I consider to be an integral part of that region: Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. So how do I come up with that definition? I've served in all these places, so it's my definition. So what characterizes the Middle East? What one single factor can you think of that all of these countries share? It's not language. Most Middle Easterners speak Arabic, but farther east, no. Persian, Dari, Urdu in Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. They're all Muslims. No, that's not quite it either. Israel, of course, predominantly Jewish, and a significant Christian community scattered throughout the area. What they all have in common is that every single one of those countries, at some point or other in relatively recent history, has been invaded and occupied by Western military forces. Be the French in North Africa, the Brits in the central part of the region and along the Persian Gulf Coast, Italians in Libya, Russians and Americans in Afghanistan, and on it goes. I mentioned the modern era. What does the year 1798 suggest to you about the Middle East? Nobody ever gets this, but since we're here at Gonzaga with all these really smart people. Yeah. It's so close. You got the Egypt part right. It's the year that Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Egypt. He had some time to kill between major European engagements, so he thought he'd spend it there. He wasn't there for long. The French were only in occupation for a couple of years. Then the Brits came in. So that's kind of the start date of the modern Middle East. It's subsequent to that we saw the European series of invasions that have continued on up to the present time. It has had an effect, not surprisingly, on Middle Eastern political culture. Middle Easterners learned a long time ago that you really can't stand in the field against the modern militaries of the West. So you put up a certain show of force, to keep morale up and whatnot. Then you kind of scatter, go to ground, lay low, hide the weapons, and then you wait. And about the time the Westerners think they've really got it all, you have figured out where they might be vulnerable, and you start sniping away. Didn't start with us in Iraq or Afghanistan. I mean, this really goes all the way back. I would call it the political culture of the counterpunch. And it's an enduring theme throughout the region and throughout time. It's exactly what we were wrestling with in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and we'll get back to those countries in just a bit. That takes me to one other point. The notion of victory and defeat. This plays in the Middle East, but it's universal, I think. When you look at past wars, total wars, if you will, conflicts like World War II. In World War II, toward the end of the war in Europe, February 1945, there was something called the Dresden Raid. It was the 8th Air Force flying out of British bases, and they basically destroyed the city, quite intentionally. Hundreds of thousands of German civilians killed in that bombing. No military significance. The war was not formally over, but it was clear. Germany was defeated. Why did the Allies do it? Just because they were bloody-minded? No, they were thinking of the concept of defeat. After all, it had only been 2 decades from the end of World War I to the beginning of World War II, with Germany starting both of them. The point of Dresden was to make the German population, as well as its military, feel utterly defeated. That there would be no resistance later. There would be no return of the Reich. The same concept, really, that propelled Sherman in his famous or infamous, depending on which side of the line you're on, march through Georgia, setting fire to Atlanta, just cutting a swath of destruction right through the center of the South. Did he need to do it militarily? No, not at all. But it was to ensure that Southerners felt defeated, that there wouldn't be Civil War II. Well, you can't do that anymore. And even when you get close to something that might look like it, we saw this in Desert Storm, the Iraqi occupation of Kuwait, and then their expulsion, which brought CNN into its own as a cable news station. Those of you old enough to remember may recall the Highway of Death, which was the highway out of Kuwait running north up into Iraq. The Iraqi army just fleeing for their lives, quite literally, out of Kuwait into Iraq, and we were on them from the air. That spectacle of clearly defeated soldiers, many of them tossed their weapons away, being killed in large numbers from the air, shook the White House, George H.W. Bush, and was a factor in his decision to halt the war after 100 hours. We just don't do total war anymore, really on any scale. And the importance of that, again, is it feeds into that political culture. The Taliban knew in 2001 that they were going to get kicked out of Afghanistan, but that probably a whole lot of them wouldn't get killed, and they could just go to ground and wait. Similarly with Iraq. We had wanted a two-front war, but the Turks wouldn't allow our troops to come south through Turkey. So we had a one-front war, and by the time we got to Baghdad, military units north of the city, they were gone. Just us farmers here. Don't look under the bed. There's nothing you need to see. But it was clear. I was ambassador there, of course, 2007, 2009, but I was also there in 2003, right after the war. And you could feel it. Talking to Iraqis, particularly Iraqi Sunnis, these weren't folks with their heads hanging down, looking like their world had come to an end. You could almost see the wheels turning. How do we get after these guys? So I'd just bear that in mind as we think about this region. Total war, not again, probably a good thing generally, but it changes the whole nature of war and what you can expect from the application of military force. So let's talk a bit about the U.S. in the Middle East. Actually, we can talk about the U.S. in the world. It's 2019. It's the 100th anniversary of many things, including the formal end of World War I with the Versailles Treaty of 1919. What did that do? What did it show us? That was America's first major step onto the world stage. The iconic moment of General Pershing standing at the grave of Lafayette saying, "Lafayette, we are here." So we contributed greatly to the war, not so much to the peace. The Brits and the French had already figured all that out. 2 years before the end of the war, 1916, something called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Percy Sykes of Britain, Picot of France, basically carved up the Middle East, which at that time was still under the rule of the Ottoman Empire, between them. What the French would get, what the Brits would get. There were other promises made in quick succession. 1916 for that, 1917 was the Balfour Declaration. His Majesty's government would view with favor the establishment of a Jewish homeland in the Middle East. And then something less well known, the Hussein-McMahon correspondence, about the same period, 1916 to 1918, in which the head of the British India office made a set of what the Hashemites in Saudi Arabia considered promises that at the end of the war, the Hashemites would be in control of a large chunk of the Middle East and would be independent. So it becomes the thrice promised land. And nobody was independent at the end. Where were we? Well, we were, as a part of the victorious forces, we were in Versailles. Woodrow Wilson was there, but really frozen out of the peace agreements. The Brits and the French wanted nothing to do with us in what they considered their turf as they set about establishing their mandates. Woodrow Wilson was already ill, and then the 1918 elections here returned an isolationist Congress that voted us out of the League of Nations, even though it was Wilson's idea. So what did you get out of all of that? Well, what many in Europe consider a 20-year truce between two halves of one horrific world war. Because that's all it was. I mean, 1919 to 1939. I make it 19 years, actually, because Kristallnacht was 1938, and although it was an internal issue, I consider that really the opening battle of World War II, the awful treatment of Jews anywhere the Nazis could get at them. So as we went through World War II, we were thinking not of the war we were prosecuting only, but of the peace that would follow. And Franklin Roosevelt was determined that it would be a very different peace and a very different role for the United States in the Middle East and elsewhere. That the U.S. would lead a new international order. That produced the San Francisco Conference. The war was still on. That established the United Nations. The International Monetary Order that moved the world from the gold standard to the dollar took place in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. NATO, and on it goes. And of course, Roosevelt died just at the end of the war, in April 1945. The improbable Harry Truman nonetheless carried on his policies and did so quite effectively. What does this mean in the Middle East division? Roosevelt, in February 1945, gravely ill, 2 months before he died, made the long, hard trip out to the Suez Canal, there to meet on the deck of a American destroyer, the USS Quincy, with Ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia. And there's that, some of you have probably seen it. It's this fabulous photograph of Roosevelt, Ibn Saud, and their entourages on the aft deck of the Quincy, which we had covered in rugs and saddles and things to lean against, and boys serving tea and so forth. And as the crew of the Quincy are looking down at something they could not even imagine. What was the significance? That was the cornerstone of our post-war Middle East policy. The basic transaction was oil for security. The Saudis had the oil. We knew that before the war. The war showed us how critically important access to oil supplies were going to be for everything that came after that war. And in return, that's the point of the USS Quincy, it wasn't a ferry, the U.S. would offer security. Why this gets interesting, of course, lots of reasons, but what we have just seen now with the strike on Saudi Arabia's oil facilities at Abqaiq, which has literally halved their production, and you've probably already noticed that prices at the pump are going up. On your way home tonight, fill her up if you haven't already done it, because they're not going to get low anytime soon. But it brings us back to the beginning. And we'll talk a little bit about that too, how the administration is dealing with all of this to the extent they are. So when you look at the broad Middle East, how do you begin to make sense out of all of the twists and turns, the machinations, the surprise of every new day? One way to look at it as an organizing principle is to think of a Middle East Cold War. Not conceptually too different from the U.S.-Soviet Cold War that ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Who are the protagonists? Well, in this case, it would be Saudi Arabia and Iran. The dominant Arab Sunni Muslim power in the region, and of course the Shia Islam theocracy that is Iran. That Cold War just got a little bit hotter, obviously. But I would note here, the the importance of history, actually, knowing what happened before. This is not the first time we have seen Saudi Arabia and Iran move to hostilities. That happened in the early 1980s, 80, 81, 82. The Iran-Iraq War was on. The new Islamic Republic was fighting for its life, and part of that fight was to prevent, do everything they could to prevent liftings of crude oil out of Iraq and its immediate neighbors. And that effort went hot. We wound up reflagging a number of Kuwaiti oil tankers. They were recommissioned as U.S. ships, and that allowed us, our Navy, to guard them, to get them through the Persian Gulf and out the Straits of Hormuz. In that process, as the Iranians pushed back, we attacked their oil platforms on Kharg Island in the northern part of the Gulf and leveled them. So corporately, we all know how this goes. We've had an oil war before involving the U.S., Iran, and Saudi Arabia, and again, I'll come back to that. The point, though, is the importance of knowing your history, knowing what happened the day before yesterday, and that's something we Americans are not fabulously good at. That's history is, that phrase, it's an aspersion, meaning it's gone, it's over, it's old, we don't care. Well, kind of the rest of the world lives its history, and again, we ignore it at our peril. I'll talk a little bit about that in the, the Iraqi context. So as we kind of look over the span of years since World War II, the emerging independence of the rest of the Middle East that hadn't already become independent, we look over that horizon in terms of the politics and the conflicts. Again, hold that Iran-Saudi Arabia thought. It doesn't explain all of the hot wars that we're looking at, but it does explain to an extent what is going on in Iraq, what is going on in Syria, and certainly what is going on in Yemen, where each country is backing proxies. Kind of got started in Lebanon shortly after the Islamic Republic took control, continues today with proxy wars. It doesn't explain what happens in Libya, for example, or Tunisia or Egypt, where there are no indigenous Shia, but it accounts for a lot of what is going on elsewhere. Not knowing our history that well, we kind of have this sense of inevitability. If it is today, that must mean it always has been. And you hear a lot of talk out there about the war within Islam, however it's styled, the Sunnis versus the Shia, that it goes back to the dawn of Islam. It has been there forever, and it will be there forever. Yeah, well, not exactly. Presidents since Truman have had doctrines named after them. Most of those doctrines have to do with the Middle East, directly or indirectly. So we've heard of the Truman Doctrine, the Eisenhower Doctrine, basically both saying we will go to war if we have to defend vital interests for the United States in the Middle East, directed at the Soviet Union. There was also the Nixon Doctrine, which was a little bit different. This was coming out of the Vietnam War. Nixon and Kissinger taking a look at all of that and saying, nah, I don't think we want to do that again anytime soon. So they developed what became known as the Nixon Doctrine, which essentially said, so in different areas of the world, rather than committing U.S. forces directly, we will work with partners in the various areas to give them the economic strength and the military power to maintain peace in their own areas. This came to fruition in only one area, which was the Middle East. There were two countries that we chose and did just that. Trained and equipped their militaries, provided economic assistance in one case, economic advice in another. Those two countries, Iran and Saudi Arabia, working together to keep the region quiet. It went to the extent of the Iranians deploying, in essence, a mechanized infantry brigade into the country of Oman in the 1970s. The Omanis were fighting a communist-backed insurgency in their west. They asked for help. Iran provided it. And the Shah's message basically was, we are a regional superpower in Iran. We can deploy, sustain, and fight outside our borders, and we can win. Did the Saudis go to battle stations as these heavily armed Persians moved into the Arabian Peninsula? No, they facilitated the deployment. Now, that was the Iran of the Shah, not the Iran of the Ayatollahs, but it's the same Iran. The Sunni-Shia difference certainly was there. It made no strategic difference whatsoever. So it's important when you get these kind of millennial pronouncements out of the talking heads, just to ask if, well, maybe let's look at the history. Let's look at how this played out in the past, and can tell us something, if not about the present, at least about the future. So outside that dynamic, as we look at the region, and over the last 6, 7, 8 years, we've seen something very, very new and very disturbing. Anyone who's looked at the Middle East knows that its history is riven with coups and revolutions and assassinations and counter-coups and counter-revolutions, and on it goes. But what we saw starting in early 2011 was different. We started to see the collapse of entire states. Not just an overthrow of one junta by another junta, the collapse of states. In Libya, in Yemen, now in Syria, where there really is no effective central government. The Egyptians, with a more developed political society, had less violence and more politics. The election of the Muslim Brotherhood, and then their overthrow a year later by the current leader. The army is back in power, much as it was under Mubarak. Just a general is a general, even if the politics are different. But in other areas, there is no government, and there is unlikely to be a government anytime soon. Why does that matter? Because of the rise of non-state actors. And of course, we Americans in particular know what that's like, the rise of Al-Qaeda, nurtured by the Taliban in Afghanistan, where they had the luxury of security and therefore the ability to plan, among other things, the 9/11 attacks. And that is why Afghanistan is so important today. We'll talk a little bit about that. How did it get this way? How did we get to the point where entire states are collapsing? And this, I think, is quite important. What we have seen over 100 years is the progressive failures of what I call isms. Start with imperialism. Those mandates I mentioned, run by the French and the Brits. What they were not about was preparing the peoples within these mandates for self-governance. They were about making as much money as they could, as fast as they could, with as few expenses as possible. No point in investing anything in, say, education, because you don't want these people getting smart. They might get sassy. That imperialism and the local governments it sponsored, monarchism in a place like Iraq or Egypt, it failed. Those Western-backed monarchies failed, in part because of the taint they had of their imperialist ties, in part because they were not exactly seized of looking after their own people either. Again, get as much as you can, bank it in Switzerland, and if you've got to take a one-way flight out of the country when the military is coming for you, you could live happily ever after in somewhere really nice like Switzerland. And, you know, again, we saw this over and over and over. Monarchism failed. It is replaced by military dictatorships. Let's just call them autocracies. Again, in Egypt, in Iraq, in Syria, they didn't deliver either in terms of, again, economic opportunity, social advancement, or even security. And on they went. We had Arab socialism, Baathism in Iraq and Syria. We had communism in South Yemen, straight-out authoritarianism elsewhere, but they all ran aground on the same thing. They couldn't or wouldn't govern. They did not establish stable, predictable rule of law, and they too passed from the scene. Now, the good news here is, as we deal with the phenomenon of Islamism, political Islam, however you want to style it, they're not doing so well either. I mean, our leadership of a multi-nation coalition and the military pressure we put on Islamic State had a great deal to do with their defeat, but they weren't winning hearts and minds either. They understood the problem. At the very beginning, as they rolled through Iraq in 2014, they did things like up in Mosul, established traffic police. I mean, they were handing out speeding tickets. That just doesn't happen in the Middle East. But it's important because it has to do with rule of law, something stable and predictable. But their own ideology plus our military pressure caused them to abandon it pretty early on. So that's the good news. The bad news is there's going to be another ism after it. I know what it, I don't know what it is. I don't know what it will be. I do know it's not going to be a parliamentary democracy. We won't like it when it comes. And again, it will not be standing on a solid basis of economic development, affordable education, and individual security, because none of the previous ones have. And again, I'll come back to that at the end. So let me just say a couple of words about some of the big things we're looking at in the region, and then we'll turn it over to you. And I'm looking forward to your questions. If you run out of questions, I'll do one or two things. I'll either stand here for 45 minutes and instruct you on the history of agriculture in Mesopotamia, or we'll just do a quick oral exam on everything I just told you. And if you don't get above 50%, the only way you're going to get out of this auditorium is by a substantial gift to People for Effective Government. You learn this stuff in the Middle East. It's called a shakedown. So we'll take a look at Iran and Saudi Arabia, because that's getting real interesting. everybody, of course, looks to the Americans. What are we going to do? And what we saw was a certain bit of flailing. Act of war, said the Secretary of State. We're locked and loaded, said the President of the United States. And then everybody kind of looked at each other and said, do we really mean that? So now you've got the Department of Defense saying, well, we're going to let the Saudis take the lead on this, figuring out what happened, where it came from, and most crucially, what to do about it. And that's kind of an interesting point. Here's my take on it. In national security and foreign affairs, the president is essentially a minimalist. He is not overeager to resort to military force. And in this sense, not unlike President Obama, wanting to end wars, not to start them. And that is not a bad basic orientation, obviously, for a president to have, certainly better than one who literally shoots from the hip. President Trump will say some aggressive things, but then kind of walk it back. Maybe remember getting out of Syria just a year ago, that we were there to finish Al-Qaeda, and when Al-Qaeda was finished, so were we. That led to some high-level resignations. So a good default position. The problem is he also tends toward maximalist policies. In the case of Iran, that would mean these crippling sanctions with conditions set forth that Iran will never meet, and we know it. To cease all support for proxy groups, which they have supported for decades. The way that's read in Tehran is that whatever we say, we're really about regime change. We're out to get rid of the Islamic Republic. That's pretty maximalist. And that kind of maximalism, as perceived in Tehran, is what leads you to the Abqaiq raids. They will go to extraordinary lengths to keep their Islamic State intact. So you got, again, an American president, himself minimalist, but allowing policies to move forward that are maximalist, and then we get caught. What do we do now? Stay tuned. I don't know, and I don't think they know in Washington either. But it is not a great place to be if you're the United States of America. And again, I still don't know exactly what was fired and where it was fired from, but here's another thing I haven't heard much about, but you want to keep an eye on. If these attacks came out of Iran, they would have to fly over where we are. We have a Navy base in Bahrain, in the middle of the Gulf. We've got facilities in Kuwait to the north, UAE to the south, down to Oman. Our military is there. I didn't hear anything so far about we picked them up on our warning systems. So if those things flew over us and we didn't see it, the lights are going to be burning late in the Pentagon. That is not a position you want to be in. What do I think is going to happen next? I don't think we're going to escalate this in a major way, but the law of unintended consequences runs very, very strong in this region. There's lots of moving parts right now, so it is not a terrifying situation, but it is one of real concern. Another hot one, Afghanistan, where we have been engaged now for 9 months or so in direct negotiations with the Taliban. They're the guys who sheltered Al-Qaeda, and with the result of 9/11, President has halted those talks, and I am very grateful that he did. It was taken as nowhere good. The Taliban had for years said that they would talk to us. They would not talk to what they called the stooge government in Kabul. We acceded to that demand. Our conversations up until now have not included the government of Afghanistan. Why is this a problem? It delegitimizes the government. And it tells the Taliban that we're not negotiating peace, we're negotiating a surrender. We're negotiating our withdrawal. And in that sense, it is painfully reminiscent of the Paris peace talks that ended the Vietnam War. Those were surrender talks. Put as much lipstick as you can on it, buy as much time as you possibly can, so by the time you're really defeated, 2 years later in the case of Vietnam, the evacuations from the roof of the embassy, it's kind of slipped into the wanted ads in the newspapers and is not right there in your face. That's the signal we were effectively sending to the Afghan government and, most importantly, to the Taliban. And then the notion of having the Taliban at Camp David, close to the 18th anniversary of 9/11, when the Taliban had not agreed to anything substantial, not even a ceasefire, would have been horrendous. So the president threw the blocks to that. We'll see what the next step is. Again, he wants out. He did not find a good way to do it. We'll see what steps the government, our administration, proposes for the way forward. Why does this even matter? Well, on one level of security, I think it's pretty obvious. We have seen the movie. We disengaged from Afghanistan after the Soviet defeat in 1989. We could see the Civil War coming, but not our problem. We were done. Goodbye, good luck. That produced the Civil War. It produced the Taliban, who took over most of the country, and it produced 9/11. Well, the Taliban are still there, and Al-Qaeda is still there. Not so much in Afghanistan, now in the border area with Pakistan. And my take, having been there again right after the fall of the Taliban, and then subsequently in 2011, 2012, the Taliban have not become kinder and gentler. It's the opposite. I mean, we have by now killed all the slow and stupid ones. The leadership that is left are smart, wily, dedicated, and will stop at nothing. We gave them the choice after 9/11. Give us Al-Qaeda, and we'll leave you alone. They chose war and exile rather than betray Al-Qaeda. They'll say anything we want them to say in negotiations because they know once we're gone, they can do anything they want. So to me, it would be the height of folly to risk our security again with the same people who did those attacks 18 years ago. There's another thing here, too. We're the only major country that is concerned over values in its foreign policies as well as its interests. It's the way we were founded as a nation, on universal principles. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is not just for Americans. It's a universal principle. So the female population of Afghanistan suffered horribly under the Taliban. Girls could not go to school. Women could not work. Women could not leave their homes unless they were under those horrific chadors. But a stylish blue rather than jet black. And we jumped on that right away. I opened our embassy after the fall of the Taliban, and about the first thing we did was start to stand up girls' schools. January 2002, I took then Senator Joe Biden to visit a first grade girls' class. They didn't have much in the way of books and supplies. They were sharing books and so forth. And the kids in that class were age 6 to 12 because the 12-year-olds lost their chance at education when they were 6 and the Taliban rolled in. And I asked one of those girls, the older girls, if she was embarrassed by being in a class with kids literally half her age, and she just beamed at me and said she was so delighted to be in school, she didn't care who she was in school with. And at a time when we're fond of saying, well, it's 18 years, we're not winning, let's cut our losses, well, things have changed. When I got to Kabul on New Year's 2002, there were 900,000 kids in Afghan schools, and none of them were girls. Now there are about 9 million kids in school, and 35% or so are girls. What do you think, and then that's education for girls, and then women. We encouraged Afghan women to step forward, go into business, run for parliament. 25% of Afghan parliamentary deputies are female. Join the military. You step forward, and we got your back. And they did step forward. And now we're kind of saying, well, that was nice, and you did really good, and oh my, look at the time. We've got to be going. So, goodbye, good luck. Hope it all goes well for you. When the Taliban come back, it will not go well for them. Some of them will get it in the neck, quite literally. So an unconditioned withdrawal from Afghanistan, in my view, not only endangers our national security, it betrays our values. And I feel it personally, because I was a big advocate of outreach to women and girls. And that school was my idea. Maybe I shouldn't have done a damn thing if we're going to cut them loose and see what happens to them. So on that cheerful set of notes, I'm going to turn this over to you. And on my way out of here, I'll just give you some of Crocker's corollaries. I've already mentioned a couple. Notion of defeat. It only has meaning in the minds of the defeated. If they consider themselves defeated, they are defeated. If they do not, they are not. And they will be coming at you again. And short of total war, which we really can't wage, that's kind of going to be the way it goes. You cannot expect a swift and permanent military victory anymore. Brings into play politics. In the Middle East, let's say that's Crocker's corollary number 2. 3 would be the forces of order and disorder. In the Middle East, we do not have the luxury of choosing between autocracies and democracies, because there is only one democracy, one full democracy, which is Israel, and boy, are they having fun. As their second national election gets into a dead heat yet again. So the choice we have effectively is between the forces of order and the forces of disorder. In my view, the forces of order would be our traditional allies. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Israel, Jordan, Turkey, not a Middle Eastern country, but they used to own it, so they know how these things go. Are they governed in a way that we deeply admire? Not a bit, of course, particularly Saudi Arabia. But before you join the chorus of saying, let's just cut them loose, we don't need them anymore. We got our oil. That's true. Our allies don't. Japan, South Korea are completely dependent on Gulf oil. And we back up. The Iranians are going to step forward, just as they did when we backed out of Iraq. So order and disorder. Related to that, strategic patience. We don't have it. Our adversaries do. What does strategic patience mean? When you're in, you're in. If you have committed forces, you better understand that there aren't going to be swift and permanent changes. We don't do strategic patience terribly well either. Again, it's like that history thing. because that's not how we build our great country. We're not about sitting down and letting things take years or decades. If you can't get it moving, then go do something else. Just drive on. We pulled out of Lebanon that way. We pulled out of Afghanistan. We were very close to pulling out of Iraq when I got there in 2007. And that was because the Iranians and the Syrians had figured out from the Lebanon experience that we were short on patience. Cause them some pain, and they will go. And we were really close to going. Congress was threatening to defund the Iraq War when Dave and I testified in 2007. That's what we're facing in Afghanistan. Taliban, no. They can outlast us. So it's a dangerous place to be. It encourages our adversaries. It frightens our allies, giving us more adversaries and fewer committed allies. So the patience thing is really big if we're going to look after our interests in the region. Number 5 or 6, I lose track. I make these up as I go. Crocker's question. I'm stealing that. It's actually Alexander's question. The question is, what will it take to change your assumptions? Let's say that you're formulating a policy to deal with a particular issue, and you just nail it. You get it exactly right. The right direction, the right resources, everything is right. And then 6 months, a year, 2 years later, the reality that you had gotten so right takes a sharp left or right. It changes. It's really hard if you are implementing a policy that you designed and worked. It's really hard to see that change. We go on assumptions that things are going to be what they were. So when they're not that anymore, will you know it? So constantly asking in this complex region, are my assumptions still valid? Another corollary. There is no bottom. You may think it's as bad as it can possibly get, but there's worse. Related to that is another corollary. How best to frame this? There are no truly good choices in the Middle East. You have bad choices and you have worse choices. It kind of goes with democracies and autocracies, order and disorder. So are we making the choices that are absolutely the ones we want? No. But also in avoiding a trip even farther down the ladder to that bottom that isn't there, you make the bad choice to avoid the worst choice. 2 lessons that I learned over almost 40 years. I'm going to tell you everything I learned over 40 years, and that will not take long because there are just those 2 things. Be careful what you get into in the Middle East. Sounds simple. The intervention in other people's territories, it's a big deal. Be careful what you get into. Be very, very careful of deploying forces. And this is one thing I think Trump instinctively gets right. He is not going to be saying anything like a former Secretary of State in another administration did in frustration over the Balkan crisis. What's the use of having the best military in the world if we don't use it? You will not hear that from President Trump. But that also has costs, and that's what I mean about bad and worse choices. So careful getting in. The second thing I learned, be even more careful about getting out. That disengagement can have consequences as great or greater as your original engagement. Witness Iraq. We certainly were not careful getting in 2003, and I was there. We were absolutely not careful in getting out in 2011. A few years later, the Islamic State rolled through, of course, and as that subsided, you now have Iran basically calling the shots in Iraq. So careful in, careful out. We were neither in Iraq. I didn't learn it in Iraq, though. I learned it in Lebanon in the early 80s. Not our invading force, it was Israel's. We thought it was a good idea at the time. That phase ended with the bombing of the American embassy. I was a survivor of that incident, and 6 months later, the bombing of the Marine barracks. 244 dead Marines. In that case, we got out. In 1984, the Israelis hung on for 16 more years until 2000, when they left unconditionally, with over 1,100 IDF, Israeli Defense Force, killed in action over those years in Israel, far more than their hot wars with the Arabs. So careful in, careful out. Now you're probably asking yourself, what was the first corollary? Because I started with number 2. Crocker's first corollary of the Middle East is 9 times out of 10, it will happen on the weekend. That was my next to the last point. Final point, and this prompted by a conversation with several people, including Dave, this issue of governance. And that, in my view, is the essential weakness throughout the Middle East. And it is why I have come to believe that we have a democracy so strong, it will never really be under serious threat. That doesn't mean we can just check that box and go watch more movies. But I've come to believe it is very true. And it's not democracy at the federal level that is so critical, or even at the state level. It's democracy at the local level. There is no other major country in the world that is organized as we are. The notion that unpaid, although elected, members of a school board will decide on multi-million-dollar projects, building new schools, so forth, is hard for most people who are not Americans to even imagine that spending authorities are devolved that far down, that people who aren't even getting a salary are making those kinds of decisions. Local government, I'm from Spokane Valley. We decided to incorporate the city of Spokane Valley. And just looking at the decisions that city council has had to make. Again, schools, infrastructure, roads, all the stuff we take for granted. I mean, those decisions aren't made in Washington. Most of them aren't even made in Olympia, thank God. They're made at the local level. And when you're that strong across the board, whatever happens at the top, you've got a heck of a lot of bulwark against. And I think we can all be very, very proud of that. And I was really kind of reminded of this in a conversation with a reporter for the Spokesman Review, who noted that she covered Spokane Valley and went to endless open meetings in which she would be there covering the meeting for the paper, and there would be about 4 people and a dog. But that's not the point. The point is the meeting was open. Has to be. Government in the sunshine. Anybody can go to any open meeting and see what is being deliberated, what's being decided for your community. The rest of the world just doesn't work that way. The other immigrant countries do, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, but they are not world powers. We are. And I think it is that local democracy that we're all engaged in, even if we don't know it, that is so critically important for the future of the entire country. And it's why, after this litany of death and despair I've just given you, I am fundamentally very, very optimistic about our own place in the sun and our ability to sustain it. So on that happy note, I turn it over to you.
Okay, we're going to take questions here at the bottom of the steps, and Dick, if you could monitor this side, and then right here. So rather than the outside, unless it's easier for you, then we can walk over with the mic. So line up here with your questions.
Oh, thank you, Ambassador Crocker, for your service. It's a great honor to have you here tonight. I have a question. We didn't touch upon Syria and the destruction that is beyond comprehension, I think, in our world. But in regards to the Russians and their involvement there and our involvement in the greater Middle East, do you have any thoughts and concerns and comments?
Yeah, the Russians under Putin have stepped up to a lot of opportunities, if you want to call them that, like annexing the Crimea, intervening militarily in Syria, assuming a leadership role on the Syrian issue, something called the Astana process that involves Turkey, Russia, and Iran, but not the U.S. I don't worry about that stuff very much. It's the economy. What caused the collapse of the Soviet Union ultimately was the collapse of the Soviet economy. Putin's Russia is not in that much better place. And Syria costs them. Having deployed forces is not cheap. And they don't have a lot of cash lying around. They threatened to become involved in Venezuela. That would be truly great. Halfway around the world. We know how much that costs. We can pay it, they can't. So I think the reassertion of Russia's role globally, not like the Soviets, but maybe like the Tsars, I don't think they're going to get very far. And I don't think they're going to be able to do enough to really threaten our interests. They have one aircraft carrier that made its way through the Bosphorus and then broke down. We got 10 with another on the way. So I think ultimately their economy is really going to limit what they can do.
There are two questions I've been hearing that I'd like to ask you. One is the real reason, if you have an insight to that, of Obama's giving $150 billion to Iran when the country is what we see it as. And the other one is we have secret things going on in Iran that seem to be in conflict with each other, the official, the unofficial. I don't know if you can address what I've been hearing.
Well, if there are secret things, there are kept secret from me too.
Okay, good answer.
Which would be a good thing. Something else I should say about Iran, it is the most complex political culture in a very complex region. And we have not been on the ground there since 1979. So what we understand about Iran is probably very little, how their decision-making process works. So that, of course, creates an atmosphere when you can have all kinds of interesting ideas or theories or suspicions or whatnot, but to actually know, much harder to do. In terms of the payoff to the Iranians, those have been a series of claims out there now for many years that the argument was that they were, effectively, this was their money that we had blocked, and in return for signing the nuclear agreement, we would give it back to them. Did that make a huge difference in their offensive capabilities? Probably not. I've watched this up close for a long time. whatever their economic stringencies are, and they are considerable, they've always had the money to fund their security apparatus. Hezbollah doesn't go hungry. The Quds Force and the Revolutionary Guards do not lack for weaponry. It's the people of Iran who pay that price. So what that may have done was made life a little bit better for the civilians. Probably didn't add very much at all to their offensive capabilities because that always had been the funding priority. There's another thing about this too. Things change, things stay the same. We talked a bit about Iran under the Shah, how he deployed infantry into the Arabian Peninsula just to show he could do it. His navy, his regular navy, also seized 3 islands in the Persian Gulf from the United Arab Emirates, the Shah. The Ayatollahs are doing exactly the same thing, projecting power beyond their borders to make the point that they are a regional superpower. They just use different means. Proxy forces instead of direct uniform forces. So Hezbollah plays the role of that mechanized infantry brigade, but it's the same worldview, consistent from the Shah to the Ayatollahs.
I want to thank you so much for finally getting around to the ladies. Because as you were ticking off the reasons why we should not be leaving out the Afghan government and why we ought to be really cautious in negotiating with the Taliban, not the least of which I was thinking, and I even wrote, and what about the women? And then you talked about our values, our national values, especially as they ought to relate with foreign policy. So thank you very much for your focus, your personal and professional focus on the women. And then your last comment, about local government. The one thing I personally find troubling is that even at the local level, there is such an influx of outside money. And so even though, we have citizen servants who step up and run for public office, the influence of big outside money, I feel, is greatly undermining the very tenets of our representative democracy. And I'm sure any of those who have run for public office, even at the local level or for state office, can attest to how much money it really takes to run for office now. And so I just wanted to comment on that. But as you were outlining this thing about the staying power and having the long view, it occurred to me anyway that it seems like when we have taken a longer view and really invested in a longer term plan of helping to reestablish, like Western Europe with the Marshall Plan, and that those were mostly white, ethnically correlated with a lot of our ancestors and those of us who come from immigrants. And so I just wonder what your thoughts are about race and the influence overtly or subconsciously that plays in how we perceive our long-term investments or not investing long-term in Southeast Asia, the Middle East, Puerto Rico, African nations.
Both good questions. Campaign finance. I've heard the comment made. There's good news in that there is strong bipartisan agreement, Democrats and Republicans, on a critical policy issue. The bad news is they both believe there should be no campaign finance reform. It is a problem, there's no question. And I did not mean by my comments on local government to say it's problem-free. It certainly isn't, and this would be just one of many. But it works. We're watching a very interesting constitutional test right now that involves this state, and it's the administration's decision to tell California that no more exemptions for you. You're going to go by federal standards. You can't set them at the state level. Well, that's going to wind up in the Supreme Court, obviously. But here's a question, and I have no idea what the answer might be. Could a state or even a city pass its own campaign finance regulations? Say that in this Spokane City Council election, here are the limits. And here is what a candidate must declare, even if it is much more stringent than what federal law allows. I don't know the answer to that. And I also don't know of any municipality anywhere in the country that has ever tried to do it, going back to strong bipartisan support for as much cash as you can possibly get your hands on. But I don't know, maybe the next time there's a Spokane or Spokane Valley Council meeting, somebody could throw that out there. And then we could be in the Supreme Court too. And on the, is there a racist tilt to our decisions on where we're going to invest resources? Possibly, but I don't really think so. I mean, we've put a lot of money into a lot of non-white countries over the years. I think the real problem is to get the effective change you want is really, really hard in societies that are not at all like ours. And when you do it in a crisis atmosphere like Afghanistan or Iraq, if you've torn everything apart and you're trying to build something real quick, boy, oh boy, the opportunities for corruption are huge. And we're into a huge mess now in Afghanistan with that, where I think the administration has taken a decision to cut off some aid flows because we've got absolutely no assurance that it is not being siphoned away. So I think it tends to be things more structural like that than explicit or implicit racism, but it's a good question to ask.
Ambassador Crocker, thank you very much for your talk. As a Spokane Valley boy, I've often bragged as I've traveled around the world to be from the same place as you. So nice to see you in person. Thank you for your awe-inspiring career, really. In your interview yesterday with Magna Chakravarti on Point, it felt like you ran out of time and that there's this second part of the Afghanistan question where I think everybody understands, or people of a certain ilk understand the concept of not cutting and running. I'm wondering what we should do then instead, in your opinion, in the ideal world, if you were running the show, and maintain the current status quo and see if the forces can be trained and government can stabilize, or do we increase capacity like as was tried under Obama? And then just a quick second part, from a diplomatic perspective, how would you have liked to have seen the response to the murder of Khashoggi while maintaining that alliance and not condoning murders of citizens of any country, but especially of our own? Thank you.
Yeah, on Afghanistan, you know, the kind of the narrative is that we've been there 18 years. You know, it's bogged down. We're not getting anywhere. There's no progress. Let's just cut our losses and be done with this. That's just not my perspective, and mine is, you know, personal experience, of course, influences all of us. I saw Afghanistan in the early going, that early '02. I mean, there was nothing. No police, no military, no education for girls, not much education for anyone else. The economy was in the toilet, except for the drugs. You know, no roads, no bridges. So you fast forward to where we are now. I mean, those 9 million kids in school, yeah, there is progress. In terms of, is the Taliban winning? Well, the DOD dropped the territorial measure, who controls what percent, last spring, and that was the right thing to do, because a lot of Afghanistan, a lot of its territory is uninhabited or uninhabitable, the desert. So if the Taliban controls the desert, who cares? If you want an indicator that may mean more, Afghanistan is what, 34 provinces? I think that's right. How many provincial capitals does the Taliban control? 0. They have taken 2 over the years, but only held them for a couple of days before they were pushed back out. And unlike the time when I left in 2012, we had 100,000 troopers there. Today we got 14,000. We are not carrying the fight anymore. The Afghans are. And with horrendous losses, they're still in the field and not showing any signs of giving up anytime soon. So I think there are metrics there that suggest that what we've got is a reasonably priced insurance policy against another 9/11 type scenario. We are not taking heavy casualties. We are not spending billions on billions that we were, again, during my time there. And I think the premium on that policy is one well worth paying. You know, the president had this right the first time, but his instincts pushed him off of it. Because when he announced his Afghan policy, that summer of 17, he said, we are going to be driven by conditions and not by the calendar. That's exactly what I think we should be doing. And the conditions are such now that 14,000 is about right. That's up a bit. We were at 12 or 11. So it would rise and drop according to the situation out there. So status quo only in the sense that we're there to support a government that is having effect, even if not total effect, but on a sliding scale. And again, our biggest problem in Afghanistan is Pakistan, where the Taliban enjoy safe haven. Why is that? Well, you know, our generals get really angry over the fact that Taliban sheltering in Pakistan then slip across the line and kill our troopers. I got pretty angry too, but unlike our generals, I served as ambassador in Pakistan for 3 years and got to understand the perspective there, which is that we pulled out of Afghanistan after the Soviet defeat, left them holding the bag. So what they were saying to me in essence is, well, we know you guys. You don't have the patience and the staying power. We saw that firsthand when you pulled back and left us in the lurch. And you're going to do it again, because that's what you Americans do. You don't have the patience. So if you honestly think that we're going to turn against the Taliban leadership and make them a mortal enemy, knowing that you're going to be leaving and we're going to be staying, and that they will still be here as a mortal enemy, you are completely crazy. That's their narrative, and of course, what the Trump administration has done with those Taliban talks is absolutely justify the hardliners in Pakistan. It's one example of the price our lack of patience makes us pay. Oh, Khashoggi, yes. Yeah. On that one, I mean, it's again, it's one of those stories you just do not want to wake up in the morning and hear. And I think it was especially resonated because a lot of us knew him. I did personally. Great guy who had been quite close to the regime. And then that fell apart. So what do you do about it? What I would have favored would have been conversations privately with the leadership about what are they going to do besides try and sentence people who were just following orders when the order giver skates on it. Do we expect the Crown Prince to turn himself in for a 25-year sentence? Of course not. That is not going to happen. But what can they do? What can we do to lever that into a better place? I'm not sure. We could not have had that conversation in the Obama years because our relationship with Saudi Arabia was as bad as it's ever been. We could have, with this administration, Trump's first visit abroad was to Saudi Arabia, which they hugely appreciated, but I don't think we did. So, say again? Oh, we were positioned with our relationship with Saudi Arabia where we could have had that kind of serious conversation aimed at long-term systemic change, but I'm afraid we did not do that. What I have learned over the years is coercive diplomacy, as it's styled, has to be used pretty sparingly, but, particularly if you're trying to affect change inside somebody else's country. You don't get it by yelling at them publicly. And again, as you look at our choices in the region, autocracy versus democracy, order versus disorder, we need to find a way to make our relationship with Saudi Arabia work and not push it over the side. The only ones cheering that one on would be the Iranians. But I do think we missed an opportunity, given the rebuilding of the relationship we'd seen under Trump. He could have gone somewhere with that. And he could have used the move in Congress to cancel arms sales and so forth. He could have used that. And again, instead he confronted Congress rather than telling the Saudis, this is serious stuff, and here's what you need to do.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you for being here today and talking to us. My name is Jack Bridgewater. I'm a WSU grad. I graduated with a political science degree and a minor in history. Go Cougs, for any Cougs in the audience. But my question for you is about energy. So a lot of us, as all of us I'm sure know, was an attack on the Saudi oil facilities. If you look at energy policy, especially recently, we have the fracking revolution with old used oil wells that we're starting to get more oil extracting it out of, shale coming out of Canada. There's an argument to be made that we are more energy independent now than we have been in a very long time. You see big movements in oil markets, but not as big as they possibly could have been if that wasn't necessarily true. So we're very energy independent, but you look at countries like China, Japan, I think you mentioned. I think when you were ambassador in Iraq, a lot of people think of the conspiracy theory of, Dick Cheney twirling his mustache and Halliburton shareholders taking a lot of equity out of that. But a lot of the oil contracts that came out of Iraq actually went to Chinese companies. So do you think that, given our energy independence, there might be some avenues for some cooperation in the region with other actors that we wouldn't necessarily see as allies, or if that, that new reality has kind of changed open up new avenues in the region?
Yeah, well, on the first part of that, that was the point I tried to make. We are energy independent now, but our allies are not. Like Korea and Japan. So unless we're saying we don't need to lead in the world anymore, so we don't need allies anymore, so let's just cut the South Koreans loose and the Japanese, what hurts them hurts us. So I think you got to do both. I mean, I'm delighted we've achieved that independence. I think it is important. But I would hate to see us give up the leadership role that would have to go along with saying we don't care whether you guys out there in East Asia get oil or not. It's not our problem. That is not a good place to be. In terms of the oil contracts, I had that conversation with the Prime Minister before I left Iraq when there were rumors out there that the French and the Russians were going to get the big ones and we wouldn't. So I went to see him about that. At that point, only ExxonMobil was left. Chevron had pulled out. And I said, if you give the big fields to someone who isn't us, there's going to be a big political problem for you. He just waved that off. And he said, look, you're going to get our biggest field, called West Korna in the south. And he said, the reason we want you to take that one is it's right up on the Iranian border. Said if it's the French or the Russians, the Iranians will push them around and start slant drilling everything else. If it's American, they won't dare. And that was the contract that ExxonMobil got. And what you got to bear in mind is these aren't concessions any longer. These are service contracts. We don't own the oil. We don't get a percentage of the oil price. We get payment for services. So, you know, it's lucrative, but not nearly as much fun as it used to be when we actually had equity in the oil. And can we work with others? Yeah, as long as they're not Iran. And even there, we've provided some exemptions, again, for allies elsewhere.
Now, before you ask your question, the ambassador is catching a red eye in about 2 hours. He's giving a talk in 15 hours on the East Coast. So I think this needs to be the last question. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks, and thank you again for coming. My name's Nancy. I actually had two questions, and he took my one about Khashoggi, so I'm going to pass and ask about good news sources, so recommended news sources that you would pass along. And then my second question has to do with a theory that Thomas Friedman put forth in his book, The World is Flat, about how the Middle East was actually developing and moving towards democracy, coming out of tribalism, one of your isms, and the discovery of oil actually artificially distorted the formation or the construction of how the Middle East then finally formed. So I would just love your take on that. You've already spoken about the history of the Middle East and the development of it, but that touches more on sort of the what the introduction of the discovery of oil did in terms of sort of a natural formation of that region. Thank you again for coming, too.
You know, one of the great things about being retired is I can say any damn thing I want. Because I don't speak for anybody but me, and sometimes not even that. So two great questions. On the first one, news sources, gives me the opportunity to say that journalists are, in fact, not the enemies of the American people. And it goes back to that point I was making earlier about local government and open meetings. You may not be at that open meeting, but I'll bet you there's a good chance that the spokesman review is. And that's really important. You know, correspondents who know their locality, know the players, know the meetings, and because of that experience could pick up if there's something they didn't write, like a discontinuity between two meetings that suggests there was something that wasn't an open meeting, little things like that, to a really important degree. I believe that the U.S. media is not a threat to our democracy, it is a guarantor of our democracy. Does that mean I like every damn thing they write? No, of course not. I get outraged, we all do. But boy, it is a really important institution. And now I can be really controversial for all of those who are concerned about their Second Amendment rights. Had better defend them forward by defending the First Amendment. Because if you lose a free press, if you lose the ability to have public discourse that is not censored or repressed, that's when autocrats come for your guns. In terms of understanding the world, it's the same thing. When I was in Beirut in the early 80s, everybody had a Beirut bureau. Not just the national papers, the regional papers. Miami Herald, Philadelphia Inquirer. And not only Beirut bureaus, they had Jerusalem bureaus and Cairo bureaus and Amman bureaus. That's all gone. I mean, your international English language press corps is probably 1/10 the size that it was in the early 80s. And I guess we can just blame ourselves. I mean, we'd rather have infotainment or whatever it is, major cable channels provide. It certainly isn't news. And that's a real concern. Where do you go for the best stuff available? As an old person, I still do like newspapers. For the Middle East, I read both the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. I try to ignore the editorial pages of both of them because they both piss me off. But in mature journalism, as practiced in this country, the editorial page is the editorial page. They don't interfere with their reporters' straight reporting. So you got the New York Times with its deeper pockets is pretty well spread around. Washington Post and Wall Street Journal less so, but all three are worth looking at on a regular basis. There are some others out there that are good. El Monitor, which has an English language news digest for the region, is pretty good. I don't know if Al Jazeera English is still on the air. I haven't checked lately. They could draw from their bureaus throughout the region, and you got some pretty good stuff there. But it's, at a time when the world or the Middle East has never been more complicated, our ability to understand it has diminished considerably from the days when we had reporters all over the whole area. So it's a challenge.
Okay, I've got just a few closing comments, and then we'll wrap up. So, first of all, thank you, Ambassador Crocker.
I did forget an important point, which is Tom Friedman's piece in The Earth is Flat. That the influence of oil clearly has had an effect. Rentier economies are not the blessing they seem to be. Just look at Venezuela. But as I look at the region, as I look at the world, I don't think that's the primary cause of the ills of the region. So if you go back to the early 50s, say, East Asia and the Middle East had a lot of similarities. Places like South Korea, for example. It was an autocracy then. Not much in the way of democracy or free political expression. Certainly not any more than you had in the Middle East at the time. But the conversation in East Asia ran something like this. Okay, people, we're going to take away your individual liberties. But what we're going to do over time is give you personal security, economic opportunity, social services, good educations for your sons and daughters, and a better life. And at the end of the day, we're going to give you your individual liberties back. The conversation in the Middle East was different. Folks, we're going to take away your individual liberties. And then we're going to hold up this shiny, glittery bauble that's called Palestine. And we're going to pass emergency laws. We will not give you security. We will not give you economic opportunity. Your kids are going to go to crappy schools. And while you're distracted looking at that glittery little ball called Palestine, we're going to rob you blind. And at the end of the day, you will have neither security, nor services, nor individual liberty. Compare East Asia today, Middle East today, I think there's something to that. And incidentally, I am not more brilliant than Tom Friedman because Tom Friedman is the one who came up with that analogy as well. There, now.
Well, Ambassador Crocker, thank you for that fascinating talk and this great event, and especially thank you for your valuable and dedicated service to our country.
Thank you.
Thanks again to Gonzaga University for the use of this great facility and all the great help that their staff gave us. They took really good care of us. Our next featured forum and speaker is Dr. Grant Forsyth, Chief Chief Economist at Avista Corporation. The topic of his talk is Socialism or Capitalism, Lessons for the U.S. in an Era of Discontent. The date is Monday, October 14th. The location is the auditorium at the Eastern Washington University Center building at the River Point campus. We'll be emailing out details in the next week, including directions and parking locations. So again, thank you all for coming tonight, and let's give one last big round of applause for Ambassador Crocker.
Okay.